welcome back to my garage. We're going to do another 7.5-inch gauge flat car. I wanted the ability to haul more than just Katie, so if we have friends or family that want to come along on the railroad, we can take them with us. So I'm partway through this, and I wanted to show you some of the layout that I did on this particular frame. This one was a little easier because I've done one similar to it before, so I knew the dimensions that I needed. So I'll show you a little bit about the layout. I started out with a center spine. This is fairly thick wall material. I think it's 1/8, and it measures 1 by 2 inches square steel tubing. I added a secondary pocket out of some thinner wall material, but just because that's what I had available. And this gives me the ability to run standard gauge height or narrow gauge height if I couple onto somebody else's narrow gauge train. So they happen to have different heights because they're scaled differently relative to those tracks. There's a 3/8 inch pinhole there that would secure the coupler, so you can drop the pin in with the coupler in either pocket. I still have to weld on the safety chain bracket here, so I've got to make those up still. We move back a little bit, and I've got the bolsters. So the bolster of the truck will ride right under here, and on one end I'll put a thin washer, so it gives it a little bit of a 3-point suspension system. So one truck can move a little bit more this way, and then the other end will be more or less flat to flat, and that'll give a nice ride. That seems to be a tried and true. And you'll have to pardon my welds here. Some of these are a little bit messy. I did not grind off the mill scale on this, and that's why you get kind of a crummy looking weld like that. But I figure since this is all going to be hidden underneath, it's still strong enough to hold. On some projects that I've done with this angle steel, I'll miter it 45 degrees and then put a weld in at the 45 and along there. And I notice you have to be really careful when you do that, because sometimes as the weld cools, it'll suck that together. And if it's not precisely 45, this will no longer be square. And there's ways that you can weld that to try to control. But this time I thought I'd try a different method. This is the same method I used on my little shorty tank car, which is the auxiliary fuel car for my steam locomotive. There's a video that covers that too. So what I did is I just used a lap joint, and I happened to have material that was 1.5 inches on this, and on the end it's 1.25 inches. And what that allowed me to do is just do 90-degree cuts, overlap them, and it gives me nice square seams that I can weld on. As far as the layout, so I cut all my pieces first, and then I went and welded a 90 here, and I use a square to make sure everything's good, and then clamp it and then weld it. And then I went to the other end and welded this 90, and I did the same for the other half of the flat car, weld that 90 and that one. And then I bring it all together with the center spine and lay it on a flat surface, as flat a surface as you can find, and double check that everything stayed 90 here, and then clamp it and weld it that way. So you can use woodworker's clamps, or you can clamp to a table surface, or you can just kind of hold it as best you can and tack it in place if you don't have clamping abilities. So that's kind of the basic layout of the frame. All of these holes I pre-drilled ahead of time so that I didn't have to worry about lining things up and then doing a hand drill and trying to go through 3 inches of metal without deviating. So that was all done on a drill press before I assembled everything. And then when I do the welding, I just put a pin through there to make sure everything's lined up when I clamp it. And same for these, just so they look good, I put a square on these to make sure that they're square with the frame. It's not completely critical that they're absolutely square, because there's a bolster with a lot of surface area there. We're at that point now where we're ready to do some of the stake pockets. You can see I've got these all laid out. I picked a center line, which is, in this case, I'm mimicking the other large flat car that I have, and these are 8 inches on center. So I picked a center line, and this one is centered and squared, and then I take one side as a reference, and I measure 8 inches, square it, clamp it, 16 inches, clamp it, 24 inches, clamp it. Same thing with this side. And I already worked out, because I'm in the center of this, the distance from here to here and from here to here should match, and they do. So my math worked out. I always use the center as the reference and measure off of that, because you could be off a 16th here and then that could compound the effect of the error, or it could offset depending on how bad your measuring ability is. Okay, I'm going to do a quick tack on these and then I can remove the clamps. Okay, now we've got them all tacked in, the clamps are removed, so now I can run a bead on each side. When you weld, you have to think about how that weld's going to cool. If I run a bead just on one side without tacking this in place, the bead will cool and it's going to try to roll that piece over. So we want to try to get some weld on either side before you run the big bead, and that'll help hold these in place. Okay, let's lay out this side. I'll show you what I'm doing here. First thing we're going to do is get our total measurement, which is 60 inches exactly. And that was by no accident. I like easy math. So we're going to make a little mark here on the edge at 29.5 and 30.5, because we know that our little piece here is 1 inch. So the center line is going to be dead center right there. So I'm going to clamp it in place, and I don't clamp super heavy. I just a light clamp because I want to be able to adjust this. So I can tap it with a hammer and kind of manipulate it with my hands to make sure that it's straight. Okay, what I'm looking for is a square. I'm holding it square and bringing it up to where the piece, there's a little bit of a radius on this piece, so I have to bring it up off of that radius. Just make sure that we're square there. There's a little bit of a danger leaving the clamp sticking out this way, and I suppose really what I should do, since I've got the means, let's do that, because if I bump a clamp, this thing can go off center. So let's do that. Let's outsmart ourselves. There we go. That's close enough. And we'll just double check. Yeah, dead center on 30 inches. There's 8 inches. 16. 24. So just align it with the right. It's easier to do an edge than it is the center. So I just reference the edge. So as long as I come off of it 8 inches, I should be in good shape. So I'll lay these out. And on these, it's hard for you to see it, but there's a little seam in there. And what I've been doing to be consistent is I lay the seam on the inside here. So we'll get a clamp on the back side. Okay, that's looking good relative to my reference. Now let's take our measurement. It's a little bit, just a hair long of 8 inches. So we're just going to bump it. A little bit more. Another thing, if you're doing these as a production, is you could make a jig. That would save you a ton of time. You just lay your jig up, pop these in, tack weld them, you'd be good to go. But I'm not in production, so I'm just going to do these one at a time. We got 8, 16, 24. It's really disappointing if you weld these and find out you're half an inch off on one of them. So we'll continue on this end. We got 3 more to do. Okay, let's just double check that everybody's happy here. 8, 16, 24. 8, 16, 24. Okay, we're good. Now we'll tack these in place, pull the clamps off. We'll be ready to run our big bead. Now we have to remember that this is very hot, so I have to resist trying to handle it for a minute. And so hot, in fact, that when I was reaching down to grab the other parts and clamps, I could feel the heat from these bottom ones still. So I've got them set up on a little wooden riser so they don't burn my workbench. All right, I'm making up my safety chain brackets, so I need to drill a hole in the end enough to clear one of these little clips, so it's going to pass through and then you can tighten up your safety chains. So I've marked off a center line, so I just need to punch those. I'll try to keep my arms out of your way. We got a nice little punch hole there. That'll help the drill bit find its center. If you don't punch them, sometimes the drill bit will start climbing all over the place, and you don't end up getting the hole where you want it. Sometimes it'll wander around. I already drilled the deck boards, and if you look at my previous video on the little short auxiliary fuel tender for the locomotive, it'll talk about how I did those boards. I listened to some of your comments and made some improvements on my methods. I set up a jig on this thing for those boards where I put the board in and I could lean it against one side or the other, and I had an end stop here and I could punch down the drill, and that worked out pretty well. So I just clamp my piece in here and find center. There's center. Put in the appropriately sized drill bit. If you really want to get precise, sometimes you could start with a small bit and drill a pilot size hole, but I'm not too concerned about that in this setup. These holes don't have to be precise because they're just holding safety chain. But if you're doing something really persnickety, you'd want to take some more time with it. And it's a little dull. You can tell it's taking a little more pressure than usual. But we'll get a little more life out of it. Whenever you do machining, it's important to get everything securely clamped, especially if you're running a lathe or a milling machine. If things aren't clamped well, they'll chatter. Chattering will cause an uneven surface. The same goes for this. We don't want this thing to get thrown out of the vise or catch on the bit and break it. Yeah, that's a dull bit. I'm gonna have to sharpen that at some point. So now we've got some holes. Let's just do a check real quick. Oh, there's a bunch of swarf. You got to be careful about that too. I'll have to knock that down with an angle grinder. Yeah, that'll work. One of the things I did is put a little radius on the end of these because they're going to hang under the end of the car, and normally when you're doing this, the car is on the track and you're reaching under, you can't really see, so you don't want to have sharp edges that can catch your hand, and you'll you put this through and then tighten it up and have your safety chains. So I'm going to take a deburring tool and just clean these edges out. Make sure we get off any little burrs. You don't want to give yourself metal slivers or scratches or cuts. And you also don't want it to tear up your safety links. That's a little better. That side's still a little bit rough. I'm going to hit that one more time with a flapper wheel. Okay, that's better. I also made some handrails, and these handrails will go on the end of the car for if you needed to climb up on it, if you're a little scale person that does that kind of thing. And I just used some stock here. I think it's about 3/16 round stock. And I basically set it up in the vise. In fact, you can see the press marks where I had them in these little soft jaws. And I marked the dimensions that I wanted. So I wanted about a 1/2 inch reach on it, roughly 4 inches on center. And the trick is, if you do them all the same, then you can drill the holes all the same on the car. So I put them all in together, and they were, of course, one straight piece. Had them clamped in the vise, and then used a hammer and did the first bend, pulled them back out, and you can still see the marks that I had for reference. Put them in the other way and did the second bend, making sure that they're all pointed the same way and together so that you didn't have twist in them. And that's the result. So they all line up pretty well against one another because they're all bent at the same time. So now all I have to do is find those hole centers and drill them on the car body, and we'll be able to push these through, and then I'll just tack weld the ends to hold them in place, and that should be sufficient. I should note, these get beat up a lot, so you don't want to weld them so good that they can never be taken out. Probably the easiest thing to do is just take a cutoff wheel, cut them off, make a new one if they get damaged. But a lot of times you can straighten them out too. Just use a pair of pliers or a wrench or something. But they tend to get beat up pretty bad, just like the prototype. Now we're going to lay out for these handrails. I kind of eyeballed this. I just laid this down, and I just took some rough measurements, about 3/4 inch and 4.5 to the center. So what I'll do is take my handy dial caliper here, make sure that we're zeroed out. We'll come out to 0.750, which is our 3/4 inch mark. And then we'll make a scratch. You just line it up there, make a little scratch. So I'm going to do that on all 4 corners. We know that this is 1.5 inches wide. We can verify that. We're going to go to 3/4 inch, which is 0.750. That's going to be roughly the halfway point down this frame. So I'm going to make another scratch like a cross, and that's my target. I'm going to punch right in the middle of that cross. And if there is, this may not be exactly the dimension. So what I'm going to do is always reference this side when I make my mark, the top side. So that way these are all going to be the same distance from the top down. So we'll take our tool and find the crosshairs and bring it up and make the noise. Makes a nice sound, doesn't it? We've selected a 3/16 drill. It might be a little tight, but that's okay. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to wrestle this thing because I don't want to put it in the drill press. There's one. You have to be careful because you know the backside's going to have some of that swarf and a little bit of flashing there, or a burr. So you don't want to go reaching around there. But that'll all take care of with the weld. When we weld it, it'll melt all that stuff in. Ooh, that's going to be nice. So what I'm going to do, I notice one of these legs is consistently a little beyond 90, so I'm going to straighten that out and they should fit just right. So I'm going to put them back together. Get them all the same. Clamp them down. And we're going to take a reference here so we know where we're going and where we're coming from. So I'm going to sight along here relative to my drill press. I'm going to just close that up a little bit. And that didn't take hardly anything at all. Look at that. Goes right in. That's great. I've got the safety chain thing clamped in place. And I've got my handrail set up. I found a little piece of wood that was a good distance to get these dialed in, so I just tapped them in until they came up against the wood. So I'll just put a little blob of weld on the back sides of those, enough to hold it in place, and we'll be in good shape. Something going on with our valve here. Stand by, we have technical difficulty. This is the point where my welder gave up on me. I did some quick troubleshooting and discovered that the solenoid valve was working properly, turning on and off with power to the machine. However, the relay that runs the solenoid valve was stuck in the on position, so the gas wouldn't shut off. After doing a quick rabbit hole search, I found some part numbers online and ordered a spare. When I went back out to the shop, I bumped it with a Sharpie pen just to see if I could reset that relay, and it worked. So far, the welder's been running just fine. Naturally, this made a good stopping point for this video. I'll put out another video or two with the rest of this project. If you like what I'm doing, hit subscribe and you'll be sure to get those updates. Thanks for watching.